and please ask questions. We want this presentation to be interactive.
Hey there, my name is Doug Shackelford, and I am president of the Rotary Club of West Little Rock. Our club, just like all of the clubs around Rotary District 6150, are where neighbors and friends and problem solvers share ideas and join other leaders to take action to create lasting change. In our club, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Jennifer Dillahay as a member. Dr. Dillahay is the state epidemiologist with the Arkansas Department of Health. She is also our 2019-2020 West Little Rock Rotarian of the Year. Our state leaders continue to lean on her every day for expertise and guidance, especially during this unprecedented time of pandemic. We are privileged to have her in our club and for her willingness to share her knowledge with Rotarians and other civic organizations throughout Arkansas.
And good afternoon. My name is Hatton Weeks, member of the Rotary Club of Jonesboro. Thank you for joining us for this live presentation. We hope you're staying safe and healthy wherever you're at in Arkansas or around the world. We have a very important discussion today because it deals with coronavirus vaccines, and I say vaccines plural, and more importantly, their arrival in Arkansas. Now, after Dr. Dillahay goes through her presentation, we'll have plenty of time for your questions. So as you can think of a question, whether it be now through her presentation or at the end, please ask away either on Facebook Live or the YouTube chat windows. We want this to be an interactive presentation, and we're going to get to as many questions as we can. We just ask that you keep today's questions relevant to the topic of vaccines. So with no further ado, let's bring in Dr. Jennifer Dillahay with the Arkansas Department of Health. Dr. Dillahay, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so glad that you've taken time to join us. We're very busy here in Arkansas getting ready for a possible vaccine. And so I'm really happy to be able to talk to you and share with you some of the things that we've learned and we're getting ready for. So let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. So today I'm going to talk about the vaccines under development and how the process works and when we might get them in Arkansas exactly. So let's just review a little bit about the timeline. So you can see that in December was really when the illness of COVID-19 first became recognized. And just within a week, they had identified it as a new coronavirus, and they named it the SARS coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2 for short. And after they had recognized its as the cause of the illnesses, they were able to do the genetic sequencing of the virus and publish it on the internet. So researchers around the world had the opportunity to look at it and use that for their preparation for whatever work they were doing. Well, there were some people who were ready to use it to make a vaccine. So they took this sequence and they used it in their what we call vaccination platform, their method for making a vaccine, and they were able to determine the gene for the spike protein on the surface of the virus and knew its design and could make a vaccine just within days, so that by the end of or the mid-March, two companies, Moderna and Pfizer, were both able to begin studies looking at the safety and efficacy of the vaccines they had prepared using this the known sequence for this spike protein. So that's very fast for coming up with a vaccine candidate. It used to take months and years to do that. But now, in the last, say, 10 or 20 years, the vaccine technology has changed so much that it's possible to come up with a vaccine candidate within days. So this is what we're looking at. Here's a model for the virus. This is the outer shell. And then there's some proteins that stick on the surface. And the ones we're most interested in is this spike protein, or S protein as it's called, because this S protein is what the immune response neutralizes. And I'll talk about what neutralizing means in a minute. So this is a little bit of a model. So here's the surface of the virus. And then here you have the surface protein that has different subunits. And then there's a special area in it, which is called the receptor binding domain. And this part of the protein binds to a protein on the surface of a human cell. And I'll show that in the next slide here. So here's a protein on the surface of a human cell. It's ACE2. It stands for angiotensin converting enzyme, which is a long way of saying something. So we like to call it ACE2. And the spike protein kind of opens up and has a little piece of protein, which is the receptor binding domain, which sits down on top of this receptor. And when they come together, it allows the virus to merge into the cell and then take over the machinery of the cell. So the cell starts making proteins and copying the genetic material of the virus to make more copies of itself. So in a sense, it hijacks the cell machinery to make copies of itself. This is a model of a protein called an antibody, which is what we produce in our immune system, and they travel around in the serum of our blood, and when they encounter something that it matches, and the matches are very specific, they will match only one thing, this antibody can sit on top of the spike protein and block it from being able to merge with the ACE2 receptor. When that happens, we say that the spike protein has been neutralized, and this antibody is a neutralizing antibody. So there's different ways of getting the immune system to make neutralizing antibodies. And one of the ways that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines use is to make what's called an RNA vaccine. RNA is the type of genetic material in the virus. And what RNA does is it is a gene that codes for a particular protein. So they've taken the RNA sequence that codes for the virus's spike protein, and they've put it in these little droplets of fat, lipid, and it protects the mRNA or the RNA that's in the vaccine so that it can get into the cell. So when the injection is given into the shoulder, it's an intramuscular injection, just like a flu shot. This lipid little tiny drop, this nanoparticle they call it, enters into the muscle cells, and the muscle starts making spike proteins, just like it would if the whole virus had entered the cell. But it's not the whole virus, it's just this one protein in the vaccine. And it makes the protein, and then the human immune system learns to recognize this protein is a foreign protein. It's not supposed to be there, and develops immunity for it and develops neutralizing antibodies. Now, the nice thing about making vaccines this way is if you were working with the whole SARS-CoV-2 virus, you would need a special containment lab, which we call a biosafety lab level 3, which is hard to work in, and these are expensive labs, so you don't need that. You can just work in a laboratory. In vitro means just using laboratory tools. You don't have to have any special tools to grow things. You can just make it in a test tube, basically. Another type of vaccine that is being evaluated for use is what we call a viral vector vaccine. And these ones that are using for SARS-CoV-2 are non-replicating. So what they do is they take a different virus, and a lot of viruses have some kind of protein on its surface. So they take out the gene for the normal surface protein, and then they insert the gene for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So this virus now looks on the surface like a SARS-CoV-2 virus, but it's not really that virus at all. It's another one. And there's two that are being evaluated. They're both in the group of viruses called Adenovirus. And one of them is one that's known to infect humans, and it's called Adenovirus number 26. And there's one number 5 that's also being used, but the one that's most advanced in its studies is Adenovirus 26. And then there's another one that infects chimpanzees, and it causes an immune response in humans, but it can't cause disease. But because these viruses that are being used in the vaccine cannot replicate, they can't multiply themselves, they've been modified in such a ways they can't reproduce themselves, they can't themselves cause infection. So, but what the vaccine does when you inject the vaccine in the shoulder muscle deltoid, just like you would the flu vaccine, then the immune system learns to recognize that virus and the surface protein on it, which is the spike protein, and is able to neutralize that spike protein if it were to ever see a real SARS-CoV-2 virus. These non-replicating viral vectors are also advantageous because you don't need a live SARS-CoV-2 virus to work with. They've been using these adenovirus platforms to make other vaccines for a long time, so they have a lot of good experience with them. And those previous adenovirus vaccines show that it has a really good B cell and T cell response. And these are two different types of white blood cells. The B cells are the ones that make the antibodies, and the T cell ones are the ones that come along and they kill other foreign cells. And so T cells are needed in the event that a SARS-CoV-2 virus infects a human cell. It will actually go ahead and kill the human cell to keep that adenovirus from reproducing itself. One of the disadvantages is if that adenovirus that is used for the vaccine is close enough in the way it looks to a adenovirus that the human who got the vaccine has already had before, they may have pre-existing immunity, enough pre-existing immunity to the adenovirus that it blocks it from being able to do its work. And so that makes it harder to do the vaccine series. So usually a lot of these vaccines are 2 doses. So the first dose kind of primes the immune system, and the second one kind of boosts it. So you need the 2 doses to make the immune response, I guess you could call it a complete response that's most effective. And then another type of COVID-19 vaccine that's being developed is what we call a recombinant protein vaccine. So what they do is they take the protein of interest, in this case the spike protein, and they find a way to make lots of that protein so that it can be kind of harvested and be enough to make lots of vaccines with it. So there's 3 different kinds of recombinant protein vaccines for the SARS-CoV-2. The ones that I'm most familiar with are the ones that use the whole S protein, and then some that just use the part of the S or the spike protein that's just the receptor binding domain. And then there's some that make these proteins that are on the surface. So you get, it's like it creates a viral particle, but it doesn't have any genetic material in it. That is the way the HPV vaccine is made. And it works very well and can produce immunity even better than natural infection. The proteins of interest can be manufactured, so to speak, by inserting them into the genes for them into insect cells or other mammal cells, yeasts or plants, or even E. coli bacteria. So you get these other type cells to make the proteins like it was one of their own proteins, and then you're able to kind of harvest those proteins and use them to make vaccine. And it depends on which one you use, you know, how much protein it will make and how quickly. So these are really good. This strategy works really well for vaccines. There are some concern, though, that if you have to modify the genome to get those different kinds of cells to make it, but it also can be modified if, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 virus mutates, then it might be different enough from what's in the vaccine that the vaccine wouldn't be helpful. It's like the others, you don't need a live virus, so you don't need those high-level safety labs to work in. And we have a lot of experience with this kind of technology for other vaccines. Some of the disadvantages is the big S proteins, more difficult to make or get those other cells to make it, which is what we call those other cells express that protein. The receptor binding domain is easier to make because it's not as big a protein. But we worry, as I mentioned, that the genes for the receptor binding protein could mutate, and it's more likely to do that in the receptor binding area that would have an effect. So that's a concern that the virus might, in a sense, escape the vaccine. So you would have to modify the vaccine. There are currently a lot of different SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in development. This is taken from the New York Times, and if you have an interest in this, you can just Google New York Times vaccine tracker and read about all the different vaccines. Around the world, there's 31 now that are in human studies. In human studies, once they're out of the lab and they've tested them sometimes in animals, then they begin human studies. They do a phase 1 and a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial. The phase 1 trials, just a few people, you give the vaccine to the people who've agreed to participate, and then you use that trial to make sure it's safe to give it to people. You study their immune response, and then you try to figure out what's the appropriate dose for the vaccine. And then phase 2, there's 15 right now, and you're doing more of the safety trial, but now you're trying to see, does this vaccine really work to prevent the illness? If it all goes well in phase 2, then normally you would move on to phase 3. And these are very large trials where you're trying to get enough subjects enrolled in your trial so you can compare the people who got the vaccine and the people who got the placebo to see if it makes a difference in terms of protection for the people who got the vaccine. Around the world, there are already 6 vaccines that are approved for limited use. They're still being studied, but there is no vaccine right now that is fully approved for use in the world. So for us in the US, we have 4 vaccines that are near the end of the phase 3 clinical trials. We have one vaccine that is very close to beginning its phase 3 trial, and then there's 4 of them that are in 1 and 2. And in the case of this SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development, they have been combining some of the trials because they have had the funding available that allows them to do that. In the US, the vaccine development for the COVID-19 vaccines is being facilitated to move faster through Operation Warp Speed. This is a partnership with the US Department of Health and Human Services that includes the CDC, the National Institutes of Health. It also includes BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. This is a government agency. Many people aren't familiar with it, but they're very involved in vaccine development. And the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense is working on a lot of the logistics. For example, they work to put into place contracts with companies to make millions and millions of the little vials that you need to put the vaccine in when it's manufactured in large numbers. And they're also working with other companies, of course, to make the numbers of syringes and all the other things you need to do widespread vaccination. So I mentioned a little bit about the different trials. And so I've heard many people express concern that the vaccines are going to be made available so much more quickly than they ever have been before. It's natural for people to think, well, they must be cutting corners on the safety and efficacy studies. Otherwise, how could that happen? But actually, that is not really the case. So I thought it might be helpful to explain that to you. So the traditional development, you work in preclinical studies trying to find a good vaccine candidate, something that's going to work in a vaccine. And you do all kinds of studies in animals. But a lot of this work had already been done with a lot of these platforms. When you get to the point where you want to work on do studies in humans, you apply to the FDA for an investigational new drug application. And then you start your phase 1 trials, of course, which is mostly about safety. Is it safe to give this vaccine to humans, and what's the right dose? If that goes well, then you do a small phase 2 trial trying to see, does this vaccine safe also, but it's also, does it really work? And if it goes well, then you move it to a much larger phase 3 trial. And phase 3 trials for COVID-19 vaccines are anywhere between 30 and 65 or more thousand participants in the US. So, and then after they go through this sequence and they have data to show that the vaccine is both safe and effective, they bring their data to the FDA and they apply for a biologics license application. And then they review it, and it takes them a long time to do it. And then if they approve it, then the vaccine manufacturer scales up its production and makes millions of doses to serve the population. Some of you may have gotten the shingles vaccine a few years ago, and you may remember or have experienced a delay in being able to get the vaccine. And this is because once it was approved by the FDA and recommended by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, it took a while for the vaccine manufacturer to ramp up the production and begin to produce the number of doses needed to meet public demand. So this can take a very long process to do. So what they've done for COVID-19 vaccination is they had already done a lot of the preclinical studies on many of the vaccine platforms, and they had good experience with the original SARS epidemic and the vaccines. They had worked on it in the early 2000s. And there's a related illness called MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and they had learned from it. So they could do these studies just within months. They then were ready to submit their investigational new drug application. And because of the funding that was available, the phase 1 was able to start, and some of them were combined with phase 2. So phase 2 carried on. And in other cases, phase 2 was combined with phase 3 so that you didn't have to use a small group first. You could ramp up already and have a big group being studied to get a result more quickly. At the same time, while these vaccines are being, the phase 2 and 3 and trials are being conducted for these vaccines, they are already ramping up, scaling up the manufacturing process, and have already made millions of doses of these vaccines. So that by the time the FDA receives the application and reviews it, they can review it in a few weeks, it could be, or a month or two. They are able to use these vaccines already manufactured to make them immediately available if the FDA authorizes the use of any of these vaccines. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is while these studies are going on, there is an independent data and safety monitoring board. So while the trial is going on, the FDA and the drug companies that are developing these vaccines are not able to see what's happening in their trial in terms of their data results. They are blinded to it. But there is a board that's independent of the drug companies or the FDA that constantly reviews the data, and it's held in privacy, so that in the event it becomes clear that there's something not safe about this vaccine, they can take action. And we have seen that with a couple of the vaccines, that a patient in the drug study or in the trial had something happen to them. And so they could pause the trial and look and see what happened. Was this related to the vaccine or not? And then if it was not thought to be related, they can resume it. But if there's a big safety issue with the vaccine, they can completely stop the trial and discontinue it. So far, that hasn't happened. And the vaccines so far are looking very good in terms of their safety. The 4 vaccines that are in the phase 3 trial are the Moderna, the Pfizer vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And the one that is going to start pretty soon is the Novavax. So Moderna and Pfizer are both RNA vaccines, and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are both viral vector vaccines. And then the Novavax is a protein subunit vaccine. So I want people to know that safety has not been short-circuited. They haven't cut corners on any of these trials. In fact, both the FDA and the CDC have advisory committees. FDA is called the VRBPAC for short, but it's the Vaccines and Related Biologics Products Advisory Committee. And the CDC has a committee called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And they have both placed safety above all the other criteria. If it's not safe, it cannot be used. Then I mentioned before the Independent Data and Safety Monitoring Board that oversees the data during the course of the study to make sure that there is nothing concerning about safety for any of these vaccines. And then, the other thing that they're watching for any vaccine, there are some potential risks. If the antibodies that are made or that the vaccine stimulates aren't the right kind of antibodies, it can actually enhance the disease, make it worse than if they hadn't had the vaccine at all. And this can happen also in terms of enhanced respiratory disease. We have seen that recently in some vaccines. There was a vaccine recently made for dengue virus. Now, dengue is a very troublesome mosquito-transmitted virus. If you get infected with one of those viruses, I think there's 4 different ones of the dengue virus. If you get infected with one, your illness is not that bad. But if you get bit by another mosquito and you get one of the other viruses after already having had the first one, it can make you really sick. And it was found that the vaccine was doing the same thing. So they've had to stop those or work a different strategy for providing those vaccines. So that's an example of an antibody-dependent enhancement. And so just to kind of show you the whole process for a vaccine being reviewed and used in the U.S., the vaccine goes through its development and testing, which I've shown you about those 3 trials. And when those trials are completed, they submit to the FDA a biologics license application. And the FDA would usually license the vaccine if it met all of their criteria. And then once the FDA licenses the vaccine, the CDC considers it to be recommended. How should the vaccine be used? Who should receive that vaccine? What age groups? Are there any safety or precautions that should be taken into consideration when administering the vaccine and so forth? So that licensure process is informed by VRBPAC, and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices informs the CDC's consideration. In fact, the ACIP votes, and it's one of the few independent bodies that actually makes policy in the U.S. One of the considerations here is that when a vaccine is licensed by the FDA, not only do they license the biological product that's given in the injection, they also license the whole manufacturing process as well as the process by which it's stored, so that you can be sure that the vaccine is made in a consistent way and that it's stored in a way that it doesn't lose its effectiveness. So that whole process can take more than a year. So in this situation with the COVID-19 vaccines, they're considering using an emergency use authorization for the vaccines. It's not because they're not holding to the same safety standards in terms of the studies and the development of the vaccine, but they do not want to wait a whole year before releasing the vaccine, because in the meantime, thousands of people are dying. So it's a balance between licensing those processes and approving the vaccine for use in a timely way. So I'm going to talk about once the vaccine is, any vaccine is approved, there's an ongoing review of the vaccine and how it performs in the general population. If the COVID-19 vaccine is approved under the emergency use authorization, they will continue to carefully monitor it to make sure that the benefit of the vaccine clearly outweighs the risks. And they will also use it to gather additional data so they can learn more about it if there are side effects. They find that in vaccines, all of the common side effects are identified within about 2 months after a person gets the injection. It's the more rare side effects that you cannot identify in a phase 3 trial. Some of the rare adverse events from vaccines that we know about may occur in 1 out of every 100,000 or even 1 out of every million people who receives the vaccine. And clearly, those adverse events are so rare, you wouldn't pick up on them in a safety, in a phase 3 trial. So they're monitored ongoing after they're approved for use in the general population or for the populations that they're licensed for. And then what they do is the efficacy of the vaccine is how well does it work under the controlled conditions of the studies, the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. But later on, when it's more widely used after those trials are completed, they study the effectiveness. How well does it work once it's released for more wide use? They continue to monitor that. And they're wanting to learn different things about the effect of the vaccines. So, for example, if someone gets vaccinated and it prevents them from getting disease, could they still get the virus and carry it and infect other people even though they don't have the illness? So those are the kinds of things they'll be looking for. We also want to know how long does the protection that the vaccine gives a person last? It's not likely that the SARS-CoV-2 infection develops lasting immunity, and it could be that the vaccines won't either. But how long would it last, and would we need boosters every so often, every 3 or 5 years or something like that? And they also want to be able to study how can you run tests in terms of how the immune system responds to the vaccine so that you can predict later on whether another vaccine is working or not without having to wait a long, long time to see if people get the virus or not. And that's really important because if we get to the point where there is not a lot of virus circulating, it will be harder to see how effective the vaccine is. One of the reasons the trials right now in the US can be so short is because there's so much transmission of COVID-19 going on in the US that the study population is readily exposed and you can see who's protected or who's not. And then they're going to continue to monitor whether they get any hint of enhanced disease, even in subpopulations. So far, not, but we will wait and see. And so the safety after a vaccine is released is really important. And we have several systems in place in the US to monitor it. One is there's the vaccine adverse event reporting system. So anyone who gets a vaccine and experiences an adverse response or something happens and they get sick and you aren't even sure if the vaccine did it or not, you can report it. The public can report it. Doctors can report it. Anybody can report it online or a telephone call or fax. And then especially we want people to report things early on because these vaccines will be new. And if, lots of people are starting to report a certain kind of thing, certain side effect, then what they do is they go to the vaccine safety data link. And this is several healthcare organizations like Kaiser Permanente. They keep databases, of course. They have complete medical records of all of the participants in their healthcare system. And so they can see who got the vaccine, who didn't, and they can run statistical analysis on the people in their organization. So this whole system covers about 24 million people. So you would more likely be able to pick up on a rare side effect of a vaccine. The FDA also uses health insurance claims that cover about 190 million people to see if they can also pick up on a correlation between a vaccine and certain kinds of claims in the health insurance systems. And then there's another group, a clinical immunization safety assessment group, then these are medical research centers in the U.S. that conduct research on actually, what causes these adverse events or what's most likely to happen and how can you avoid them. So that helps us with vaccine safety also. And all of this is just really very important. It's very timely in the U.S. because of the skyrocketing rates that we have. So here are the 10 current countries that are most effective. And so you see this green one right here. This is the United States. This orange one right here that's coming down is India. This kind of bluish one right here is Brazil. And then this orange one right here is France. So you can see clearly the U.S. is on a large upswing. And this is data from today when I made this slide. Yesterday, the slide from yesterday, today isn't out yet. But you can see that we're having hundreds and hundreds of people get sick every day, which gives me a pit in my stomach because these are all real people. And some of these people are going to die. We had 30 deaths reported today. We had a record yesterday in hospitalizations. And our hospitals are going to be overwhelmed if we do not do something to rein this spread of this COVID-19 in. Lots of people on ventilators, and about half the people will not come off a ventilator and that they are going to die. They will not leave the hospital. So these are very alarming. We all should all be alarmed, but we should also be heartened because Pfizer and Moderna have indicated that they plan to submit data to the FDA toward the end of November. And if the FDA and the ACIP are both able to complete their reviews quickly, we may have vaccine available to people in Arkansas before the end of December, maybe even mid-December. So we're getting ready. We want to deploy the vaccine to the people who will need it the most, because in the beginning, we won't have enough doses for everyone. So we're looking at healthcare workers because they're most likely to be exposed. And we're also looking at people who are most likely to experience severe disease, such as older adults or people with chronic health problems of any age. So I'm going to stop now and take questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Dillahay, State Epidemiologist with the Arkansas Department of Health, asking a lot of questions, fellow Rotarian, and getting a lot of Rotarians on board, hearing from Mason with the Rotary Club of Sherwood, Beverly and John with the Rotary Club of Jonesboro. Thank you for tuning in. And Dr. Dillahay, getting a lot of questions about the safety of this vaccine. And you went into great detail about the study and the research and the work that has been put into this vaccine over the course of the past few months. And if you look at the timeline of other vaccines, polio, for example, I think took 7 years, which is something we're all very familiar with the Rotary Club. So a lot of work has been put into this, these vaccines, I should say plural vaccines. And James Hollander asks, I'm going to start him off here with our questions. He has several, but the second one I thought was most important, if we could put that up. He said, are vaccine effects minor enough so that health workers and school personnel who get vaccinated don't have to miss some days of work? And I assume he's asking more specifically about side effects.
Yes. So the side effect profiles haven't been published yet. I have seen some presentations on them. The Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine are both 2-dose series. So the Pfizer vaccine is 1 dose, and then a minimum of 21 days later, you get your second dose. And the Moderna vaccine is 28 days for the minimum interval. From what I'm understanding from what's been published so far, the second dose produces more discomfort and could cause fever. And it's more likely to happen the second dose than the first dose. And it's more likely to happen in younger adults than older adults. So it is possible that some of these vaccines will have an effect. Well, someone might decide not to go to work or might feel ill. We'll have to see what the data shows after it's all made public. We know that with the shingles vaccine, for example, a lot of people did feel sick after they got either their first or second dose. So we'll just have to wait and see. But so far, there have not been any great concerns about very, very severe side effects. But that's all not been made public yet.
Dr. Jennifer Dillahay, Arkansas Department of Health State Epidemiologist. She's the viral infectious disease specialist for the state of Arkansas. If you have a question for Dr. Dillahay, just ask either on the Facebook or YouTube chat windows. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Thank you, Becky from Rotary Club in Killeen, Texas, for tuning in this afternoon. Want to ask another question here from Beverly Gilbert in Jonesboro. She says, my husband is allergic to eggs and can't take the flu shot. Are eggs involved in the production of either of these vaccines for COVID? Thanks.
Okay. Well, let me just start with the flu shot. So some flu vaccines are grown in eggs, but now we have others that are not. Plus, the manufacturing process for making flu vaccines is so good that it has been shown that there's not enough egg protein even in the flu shots that are grown in eggs to stimulate an allergic response for the flu shot. So egg allergy is no longer a barrier to getting a flu vaccine. All right, but these other vaccines that I'm talking about aren't involved in eggs at all because they don't have to grow them in eggs. That's where it comes in the flu shots, but they are not growing these vaccines in eggs at all. So there won't be a problem with that.
One more on safety and effectiveness of vaccines. Gregory Hansen here in Jonesboro also asking, read about how viruses can mutate and become weaker. Is this process relevant to what we know about this particular novel coronavirus?
I think it's too soon to tell. We've had the other human coronaviruses circulating in the human population for a long, long time. There's 4 that cause the common cold. And maybe when they first started in humans, they were very severe. It's hard to say. But at this point in time, we're not there. I've seen some studies that show this virus mutated and maybe makes more severe disease, or it mutated and makes it more infectious and so forth. But overall, it's just too new to tell.
Dr. Jennifer Dillahay with the Arkansas Department of Health taking our questions this afternoon. Getting a lot of questions. I want to transition now to the rollout of several vaccines. And it's my understanding that it will be several vaccines that will be available here in Arkansas. And I tell you, I'm not excited to get a shot, much less 2. But you have to do what you have to do, right? So can you kind of give us an estimate, your best guess on when the general population here in Arkansas can expect to see a vaccine in our communities?
Sure. So assuming that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine are available in Arkansas sometime in December, then the doses, as I mentioned, aren't going to be enough to vaccinate everyone. So we will make those vaccines available to the highest priority groups, as I mentioned, healthcare workers and likely persons who are 65 and older, and also other persons at risk for severe disease if they get it of any age. Now, I did want to say that these vaccines are just being rolled out for adults. They will not be available yet for children. So we'll get those initial allotments, and every state will get an allotment or an allocation based on population, and they'll be rolling in perhaps on a weekly basis. So by the time we can get to we get all the high priority groups vaccinated, it might be a few months. So I would say perhaps in about April, the general population will be there'll be enough vaccine for everyone that wants to get one to get a vaccine. And then we'll have to wait and see about the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They may roll out in the spring also with their initial doses. And so we may have the luxury of having 4 different types of vaccine available. And so we'll be trying to use them strategically as to what populations they're best for. The ACIP will help us with recommendations for who should get which vaccine. And I'm looking forward. I think the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, if I remember right, is just 1 dose. So that will be a plus also.
And Patrick Mathau ask the fun question here. Is the state equipped to face this logistical challenge?
Well, I would say yes and no. So the Arkansas Department of Health has been practicing giving flu vaccines in mass dispensing for a long time. Every fall we do it through drive-through clinics, through large walk-up clinics, and we've had to modify that because obviously you don't want people lining up in a small area to get their COVID vaccine because you'll spread COVID while you're doing it. So we are actually pivoting so that we can partner with pharmacies around the state to give vaccine. And we're working with our county offices of emergency management to help them manage the logistics of that, because they've been helping the health department do it for many years. So they know about how to do the traffic flow and all those things. And then a lot of the vaccine will be deployed potentially to hospitals or to pharmacies that will take it and vaccinate people in long-term care. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I hope that you will think kindly of us here at the health department because things change on an hourly basis and we're having to pivot and turn. But the amazing thing is that people in the hospital systems, the pharmacy systems, emergency management, all these people are willing to come together and help. And I hope Rotarians will help too. If there's a pharmacy in your community that's doing one of these events where they're trying to vaccinate a lot of people, go and help. That would be a wonderful advantage to them, is to have just people who can help with the intake forms or to do something that's non-medical. If you're a non-medical person, they'll need, it'll be all hands on deck. And, we will all need help, and we got to help each other.
Absolutely. To get through this, it's the Rotarian way. Dr. Jennifer Dillahay with the Arkansas Department of Health joining us, taking your questions. So if you have a question, just ask away. We'll get to as many of those as we can today. Our topic is about coronavirus vaccines. Francine Brunel, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, Francine. Could you comment on the need for refrigeration and how that might impact ultimate effectiveness? I know one of the vaccines requires a ridiculously cold temperature. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. So because RNA is fragile, both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are frozen vaccines. So the Pfizer vaccine was developed in such a way that it has to be maintained at a minus 70 degrees centigrade, which is outside of the range of the normal freezers that we use for frozen vaccines. We use freezers for the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine we call it, and the chickenpox or the varicella vaccine are both frozen. So it's outside that range. So many hospitals and pharmacies have purchased special freezers to keep these vaccines. When it comes shipped to Arkansas, it will be shipped in a special container on dry ice. Dry ice will maintain minus 70. So if the shipping container is handled properly, then the vaccine can be maintained for 5 days on the dry ice, and then you replenish it in another 5 days, and then you replenish it in another 5 days. So, and hopefully in the meantime, you've used up all your vaccine, because we want to get it out to as many people as possible. Also, one of the challenges of the Pfizer vaccine is the smallest number of doses that you can order is 975. That's one tray, and a shipping container can hold as few as one or as many as 5 trays. So those will be deployed to places that can handle a large number of vaccines. So the larger hospitals that have the larger number of healthcare employees, for example, and the larger number of COVID patients that they take care of, because that increases the risk. That's one of the considerations. The Moderna vaccine is frozen, but it's at the temperatures of our usual freezers. And once you thaw it out, you can, it's thought to be stable for several days. So you could use it, you take it in a refrigerated cooler to go vaccinate people out in the community. So that's a little bit more flexible.
Gotcha. So you will thaw it out before it's injected. I'm just thinking of something near absolute zero going into my arm.
So the Pfizer vaccine, you have to thaw it out, and then you inject some normal saline into it to liquefy it. And once and it's got 5 doses in a vial. So because it doesn't have a preservative in it, you have to use up those 5 doses in 6 hours, or because of the risk for contamination and something growing in there, right? So if you don't use up those 5 doses within 6 hours, you have to discard the remaining doses. And so the people doing the vaccinations are going to have people lined up in order to make that happen, because we just can't afford to waste any vaccine doses.
Absolutely not. Dr. Jennifer Dillahay with the Arkansas Department of Health. Going to take a couple, 3 more questions here before we wrap things up. Scott Trotter asks, will at-risk populations have a higher priority? And I am assuming, I know the medical community will go first. You mentioned the nursing homes.
Yes.
But what about those with underlying health conditions? Will they be able to get in line next?
Yeah, so we're still working out the exact order, and it shifts from day to day with input from the CDC. The ACIP will make the final recommendations, but we are really concerned about our Black, Latino, and Marshallese population in Arkansas, because they are at increased risk for severe disease. And so we do have plans to reach out to them and try to get them vaccinated early on, because of the very harsh impact that COVID-19 has had on those groups.
Taking your questions here, another one from Marty Allen, cutting right to the chase here. What's the cost? Do we know how that will be worked out?
Yes. So the vaccine will be made available to all adults in America at no cost, out-of-pocket costs to them. The government has purchased the vaccine. The U.S. government's paying for it. So it won't be any out-of-pocket costs to the patient. The clinics and the pharmacies and the hospital that administer vaccine can bill for administering the doses. So if you have insurance, your insurance will cover the cost of administering the vaccine. And for those that don't have insurance, then there's a process being worked out where it can bill to the Department of Health and Human Services. So it won't be any out-of-pocket cost. Cost will not be a barrier to anyone.
Dr. Jennifer Dillahay with the Arkansas Department of Health, taking your questions. Getting one here from Tiffany Hoffman-Smith. Are children involved in the testing through this? You said it was going to be available for adults only, the vaccine, but any kids involved through the testing?
Yes. So initially it was just adults, but as I understand it, Pfizer has begun to enroll children down to the age of 12. And I understand that plans are in place for enrolling more children in some of the other trials. So that will take time. That will not be, vaccine for children will not be as available as soon as it is for adults.
And the last question here, I'm going to give one final push to get a flu vaccine. So can you get a flu vaccine and the coronavirus vaccine at the same time? Do you need to space those out if you haven't gotten a flu vaccine yet?
So the co-administration of those vaccines has not been studied, so I can't comment whether it's safe or not. I do encourage everyone to get their flu vaccine now. Flu is starting to circulate in Arkansas. We've already had 4 deaths. You don't want flu and COVID-19 at the same time. But, you know, flu puts a lot of people in the hospital, and it could be that you get the flu, you need to go to the hospital, and there's not a hospital bed. So please get your flu vaccine now, because it can really help keep you out of the hospital.
Absolutely. You can see it there. Mask up, wash your hands, keep your distance.
And
Dr.
avoid crowds. I would encourage people for the next several weeks, do not be around any group that is 10 or more. Stay under 10 with any group that you're with, and try to stay with your household if you can.
Great information this afternoon. Dr. Jennifer Dillahay, keeping us all safe, the state epidemiologist with the Arkansas Department of Health, and fellow Rotarian. Thank you for your time this afternoon. And before we go, we'd like to ask you for a favor. If you have a topic for a future conversation with Dr. Dillahay or another expert, please let us know. We're looking to use this platform again in the future. And we'd like to thank you for joining us. This has been a special presentation by the Rotary Clubs of Jonesboro and West Little Rock. Stay safe.